Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensies. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Now, before we get going here on this episode, I wanted to introduce a new option for you guys. So some of you have been asking me, how can I support your show? And just millions of you have been asking me this. But I added a Patreon account, so if you're impatient like me and you want to get the episodes as soon as I record them, go over to Patreon. I'll put a link in the show notes. Go click on my Patreon, become a supporter. If you support this show for $5 a month, you get this Parker's Pensies sticker, and you get instant access to all the episodes the day I record them. If not, if you're patient, unlike me, and you can wait for the episodes to appear, then just wait on the normal listing, and I will release them 1 to 2, maybe 3 podcast episodes a week. If not, again, if you want them all, go over and support the show on Patreon. But enough prostituting myself out. Let's get to today's guest. Today I have with me Michael Jahosky. He is an assistant professor of humanities at St. Petersburg College in Clearwater, Florida, and he's been teaching there for 10 years. He's also active in a local church that he's been attending for 7 years, teaching classes on apologetics, and he's also been involved in campus ministry clubs on and off for the past 10 years. His academic background is in classical and biblical history, philosophy, theology, and the arts. Michael earned a master's degree in humanities from the University of South Florida and is author of The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle Earth, which will be the topic of our conversation today. Michael, thanks for being with us, man.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it, and I would definitely want a sticker.
Yeah, absolutely. We can make that happen.
Yeah, great. Happy to be here.
So you're a humanities professor, and it shows up in your work because your work is a little hard to classify. I was thinking about this as a work of apologetics, cultural apologetics, literary criticism, philosophy, theology. Does it fit nicely into one of these categories? Is it more interdisciplinary? How do you think about your work?
I was just trying to look to see on the back of the cover if they classified it, just to see what Whiffenstock had done. But, I was greatly inspired by, Paul Gould's recent cultural apologetic approach to looking at apologetics. And so I would definitely include it in that genre. What we're looking at is, 3 books. I talk about The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion. We kind of work backwards through my book. That is a part of Western culture, world culture. So I think it definitely classifies as a work of cultural apologetics. Alistair McGrath has been publishing along with Holly Ordway in literary apologetics. It might fit in that niche.
Okay.
But yeah, it is kind of crossing disciplines, definitely an interdisciplinary work. I do lay that out in the preface or the introduction, one of the two. I say, this is my background. I didn't go to seminary. I think Dallas Willard once said something like, if you go to the university first, seminary is open to you. But if you go to seminary, sometimes it's harder to go back in.
Yeah, totally.
So I think it was Dallas Willard who said that. And great book, The Divine Conspiracy. So, I feel like this is my humanities profession in a book. So it's definitely more interdisciplinary, but I think it fits in some of the other popular works we're seeing in apologetics today.
Yeah. That's awesome. I really enjoyed it. So I highly recommend it. Just to begin here, again, it's called The Good News of the Return of the King, and it's the Gospel in Middle Earth. Ta-da. There it is. Boom.
Yes.
So, Michael, why write this book now? Why write this book at all?
Yeah, so I've actually been thinking a lot about that, and I do lay out the story in the preface, but as selfish as it sounds, and I hope it doesn't come off the wrong way, but I really wrote the book for myself in many ways because the Holy Spirit kind of was guiding me in 2001 to kind of, think about what it meant to be a Christian. I tell this story about how I came to write the book in the preface, and I can get into that a little bit, but it didn't choose to write it in this time in any particular way. It's certainly, we're seeing a lot of books and apologetics being released nowadays, but yeah. What I realize now in retrospect is when I started the book formally, I think in 2015, the book kind of started working on me, or me working on the book back when I was, a kid in 2001. But I wrote it back to my original point for myself because I wanted to explain what The Lord of the Rings was doing to me. And what I essentially discovered was that I had heard the gospel unbeknownst to me, first in Middle Earth, and that I learned that I was not the only person who had this experience, which was a really great revelation. I learned that once I started researching for the book. And so in many ways, it's just kind of a self-discovery, and I wanted to share, I guess it's kind of a book for everybody, but indirect communication in general is really, as apologists know, really great for people who are on the fence, who are unbelievers or skeptics and seekers. And so it's definitely a book mainly for them. And for anybody who's felt that they've been moved by Tolkien's mythology in particular, and again, just to make sense of what was going on in my walk as a Christian, a disciple of Christ, I should say. And that's the primary reason, and hoping that other people have felt the same way. And I think, you and I both know a lot of folks have. So, yeah,
that's awesome, man. So as a lot of my listeners will know, I love to start with some definitions of stuff. And I was excited in your book to find all these definitions of parables, supposals, allegory, worldview, myth. I particularly liked your treatment of worldview, but we can get to that in a second. So I want to just go through a couple of those if you don't mind here. So
not at all. Yeah.
What's a parable?
Yeah. So, parables, let's say what they're not first. The traditional understanding of a parable, in the words of N.T. Wright, is an earthly story with heavenly meanings, very Platonic story. As listeners will know, most likely there is a lot of overlap with Platonism, Neoplatonism as well, with Christianity. But, two things that have one thing in common don't have all things in common. There are some similarities there, and certainly parables have supernatural elements to them. But unlike Platonism, the Jewish worldview underpinning the parables is a holistic sort of view of the world. And so they are informed what they mean to say in content, is what I repeat throughout the book as kind of a beat to the book to have you understand that. And so I think we definitely need to understand the Jewish context behind parable, and we'll get into that. Back to basic definitions, though, so a parable is not an earthly story with heavenly meanings. Although heaven and earth do figure into this, it's not that way. They're not short moral stories or short stories with a moral point, how to be a good boy or girl. Amy Jill Levine, has written a great book on the parables recently called Short Stories by Jesus. It's a really good one, and it's somewhat recent. And she talks about the challenging aspects of the parables, and anyway, we'll get into that. But back to what I was saying. Parables literally mean to throw from the side. Para and balein. So the two words parabole form this kind of what I think Dickinson said, to tell it slant. And I have a Emily Dickinson reference in the book. She's got a short poem all about how we have to tell the truth slant, and that's what parables do. They cast alongside, they juxtapose, they create a resemblance between two unlike things to show that in fact they do have something in common, and in this case, kind of heaven and earth. And so to throw from the side or to cast alongside is the basic definition of a parable.
Okay. Would you say it's more indirect than direct?
Definitely.
Okay.
However, I would. But there are direct elements to a parable, and that I will submit are the allegorical elements, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, in due time. Allegory is such a loaded concept.
Right.
Oh man, I didn't know what I was getting into when I was researching this book, but it is definitely indirect, and we can speak to that if you want in a little bit about indirect communication. But yes.
Well, so I always, when you talk about parables as a Christian, you always think parables of Christ, right? Naturally. And I wonder, I haven't done any research on this, but it just popped in my head, with Samuel's coming to David, and he's saying, here's a story about this guy, and he's a king, he's rich, he had a bunch of sheep, but he goes and takes this dude's lamb for his visitor, and David gets all upset, and he's like, this man should pay fourfold, and he goes, you are the man.
Yeah.
Is that a parable, or is that something else?
I think my research, Brad Young wrote a book on the Jewish kind of background of the parables that I have in the bibliography. And I think he classifies that, and this gets us into the Hebrew word for parable, which is mashal, plural mashalim. Mashal is such a multivalent term. I mean, it can mean, or polyvalent term, it can mean riddle or a challenge or a dark saying or a parable or an allegory or a metaphor or a simile. It's it's all of those things at once. So I think he classifies that Nathan and David it could be. It's definitely a parable. It has a pointed end. Certainly it's a challenge parable. We'll talk about that later. I know it's on the outline, or a parable with a challenge in it. It has some teeth to it. I would say parables are not determined by their length. It's not. We have book length parables. I think the book of Ruth is a good one, a good example about was it the great grandmother of David? I think she was Ruth and Boaz.
I just read this in the Old Testament. I don't know the lineage. I don't remember if she was great grandma or just grandma.
Related.
Yeah.
In a close way. The book of Job has been submitted by many to be a book length parable. And so you have, Lord of the Rings as a parabolic novel, as one scholar has called it. And so you can have parables that are 2 sentences or 2,000 words or 2,000 pages. It depends on how the story affects us and the way that language is used. And beyond that, also the underpin, the worldview underneath it, I think. But it's not determined by length. So I would say it could be classified as a parable. Okay. But I have to say what he says in that book. But anyway, yes, it could be.
Yeah, I really like that. That's a great point, that parables don't have to be just tiny little short little stories. They can be, and what you make in your book, you make the argument that the Lord of the Rings is a parable, or at least the Return of the King.
Yeah.
And I wonder, so going back to Plato, you made an interesting point earlier, pulling from N.T. Wright. Do you think so? Are Plato's dialogues, would they be classified as parables or not quite?
I may not have the academic background to comment on Plato's works in particular. I think there's been a variety of different opinions on this, but certainly we know the Allegory of the Cave, which is book 10 of the Republic, I think, which is the most famous dialogue and work of Plato, arguably Timaeus, the Laws, all of those others that we know, Euthyphro, which is one of my favorites. I would certainly say that, I'm thinking of the Euthyphro dilemma, and that dialogue definitely in a sense is a parable, or, an extended Socratic dialogue. Obviously we know it to be. And this gets into indirect communication. Socratic dialogue is a game of hide and seek, really is what it is. And that's not my wording. Benson P. Fraser just wrote a book recently called, I think, Hide and Seek, and it's all about indirect communication. And I highly recommend it. And I think it's a great way to put it. And so I think that they could be considered that way. Sure.
Okay. I love that. I love, I wrote a paper on biblical wisdom and like a biblical theology of wisdom. And I looked at Job, and as I read Job a couple times through it, it seemed to me like Job's just a proto Platonic dialogue on the nature of God's justice and, theodicy. And he's got Job, and he's got his characters in there, and he's even got his friends coming through, and no, that's not right. And then God answers from the whirlwind, and
it's great.
And I love it. And I think that indirect communication, it happens all throughout Scripture, right? There's some propositions in there for sure.
Absolutely.
But a lot of it's storytelling. A lot of in the stories, there's parables, which are like sub stories, and so I really like that.
I love what you did with that connection. I see it now. Yeah, I agree. And many scholars have pointed out, a bunch of them in my bibliography. Brian Godawa wrote a book about this too, about sacred communication or indirect communication. And I think he measured it basically, but it's like 70% of the Bible, something to that extent, is not proposition, but it's mythos, it's narrative, and therefore indirect communication. So imagery, mashalim, right? Riddles, parables, allegories, dark sayings, proverbs are in there as well, that are considered. I forgot to mention those. So certainly, yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So moving on, how about supposals? Is that a Tolkien word, or is that only Lewis, or is that between the two?
I could not find any synergy between Tolkien and Lewis on this, as most listeners will probably know, and I know you know, that they were good friends for at least most of their life, from the early to mid to late 1920s into the 1950s. And I don't think Tolkien ever borrowed the term, but it is a Lewis term.
Okay.
And my most recent recollection of the use of the term supposal comes from several of Lewis's letters to fans and collected letters of C.S. Lewis. You can find Kindle editions or hardcover editions. I could find in my endnotes somewhere the exact letter. But, readers and listeners can find it pretty easily. I'd be happy to hunt it down for you. But yeah, he he says that supposal is set against allegory and that they're not the same thing. And I think we'll get into that, but it's the way that language is used and the alternation, excuse me, between allegorical language and metaphorical language. And as I'll point out later, a strict allegory, which Lewis and Tolkien both disliked, and set against the parable, fairy story, supposal on the other side, is very heavy-handed. It's very clear. Allegorical language and allegorical composition are there to help remind you of what you already know. They're not there to advance any knowledge. And so it's a story that's thinly guised to tell you what you already know. And you think of what I always mess this up. My wife's going to crack up if I say it wrong. Is it John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress? I think I almost said Paul Bunyan, and that would have been good. So let's go with that.
Yeah, Paul had the big blue bull or whatever, water buffalo.
Right. And this is a typical example. And I think there are some Lewisian examples in the Chronicles of Narnia, but there's a giant called Despair, and one guesses to what he is. So, you already know what that's like as a Christian. You've had struggles, and so that kind of story, which is very allegorical, is that there to tell you what you already know. So supposal, I think, was, to come back to the point, was Lewis's version of what I would say is Tolkien's fairy story, and both the supposal and the fairy story, I think, are analogous to, or at least very similar to, the New Testament parable. Yeah,
that's interesting. Okay, yeah. So Lewis is using the word supposal, and Tolkien's using fairy story.
Yep. And just to finish real quick, I just have a few other blurbs about a supposal. So Lewis basically describes it as a hypothetical what if scenario of what if Christ were a lion. And what would that show us, where there's not an exact correspondence. And as readers and listeners will know, that if you've read the Chronicles of Narnia, not all of the correspondences are clear. Some of them break down between Aslan and Jesus Christ. So it's a hypothetical what if story. What if we looked at the gospel in this way? Come over here and change your perspective and inhabit the story that you know so well in a different light. Yeah. What would it look like if we did that?
And he's adding new information from the what if kind of supposal, right? So it's a little bit different than allegory. And there's that, there's not that direct, obvious one-to-one correlation. I think Lewis also, I love Lewis. I've read, most of Lewis. I love Tolkien, but there's more to Lewis. Like there's more, like I have all his letters and everything, I don't have all of Tolkien's. But he does this kind of supposal thing with the space trilogy, where he's like, well, what if Adam and Eve took place on Venus, in a different place? What if, it's not direct one-to-one. It's not the same story happening over, but it's like that. What would happen if?
That's exactly right. And I haven't read in full the Paralandra. Is it the space trilogy? I think it's referred to. I've been meaning to get into it, but I did come across some bits and pieces in my research. But yeah, I can see that. And it's not the same. I mean, and so one of the things we can talk about is it's the degree to which the author wants you to trace, and I'm standing on the shoulder of great scholars here who have already said this, it's the degree to which the author wants you to trace the allegorical correspondence between the thing you're experiencing and the reality it's pointing to. Yeah. If it's clear and translucent, again, it's not going to teach you much, and you're going to say, that means that, one way of saying that. But if it's more like, how did Sally McFagan wrote a book about this and said, if it's more thick like a painting, you can't see through it, you get this reflection, but not a quite like a resemblance. And so it was a really great way to put it, the window versus painting, and that really, it just clicked. It made sense. And I think that Lewis, to his credit, was not always very clearly allegorical. I think Sons and Daughters of Adam and Eve obviously is one example where it is, but you think of, Aslan's country is very Jewish and very Platonic, and it kind of gets you guessing in different directions. And I'm sure if we sat here and thought about it, there are lots of examples in the books where it's not exactly the same way that we know it in the Gospels. Right. It adds to it, as you said.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, we've been kind of circling around this, but let's get into allegory then. You can see all sorts of great memes online between Tolkien and Lewis, and I just saw this recent one. Maybe we both saw it, where Tolkien's like, I don't like allegory. Don't. How dare you say that
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings is about World War One or two, or whatever.
Right.
And then
Right.
Lewis is at the bar saying like, if somebody does, if one person even doesn't get that the big lion is Jesus, then I'll set myself on fire. Right. And there's all these like common conceptions that Lewis loved allegory and Tolkien hated it. So I'm hoping to clear some of that up. But real quick,
Sure.
what is allegory?
So every word we use is an allegory, and the Greek word allegoria is again a compound word, allos, and I think I forget the second word, but agoria. I think it has to do with the marketplace, the agora. I think it has some connection there, and it basically means to speak of one thing as another, or to see as, or to talk as at a substitutionary level. Now, you could make a case that metaphorein, the Greek word, another compound metaphor, is also very similar to that, and that these are just two ways of saying the same thing. But a lot of scholars that I researched make a distinction between metaphor and allegory. Others don't. And so it depends on who you're reading. But back to allegoria is, one thing as another. And so Joseph Pierce, a great Catholic Tolkien scholar, has written that every word is an allegory, right? We don't have direct access to reality. We have to everything is kind of indirect. Even scientific rational discourses, which we treat so, like it's the only way to know reality today. We give it primacy, but it isn't. By the way, Tolkien's got a great line about that in The Lord of the Rings through his narrative. But anyway, allegory at its basic level is to speak of one thing as another, and yet. From there, it gets into distinguishing between allegoresis, which is interpreting something as allegory, and oftentimes not reading something correctly, like Origen, the early church father, who is famous for his allegorical interpretations, engaged in allegoresis. And so some scholars will say that you can say allegory is not even a literary genre; it's an interpretive hermeneutic act.
Yeah.
It gets wacky from here. And then you have people who say, well, there's a difference between allegory as composition or genre and allegory as a mode, as a way of using language. And I'm going to give some clarity on that, and I'll use my hands to kind of make an illustration because it will help, I think. And I know those who are not watching the video or just listening, have to kind of close your eyes or maybe draw a chart. But we're just starting slow right now. But there it is. Yeah, that's allegory.
Well, so there's this kind of popular trope, and maybe it's warranted or justified, that Tolkien hated allegory. He took Lewis to task because he thought Lewis was just playing with his toys, and Chronicles of Narnia is adding in all these things, and he doesn't quite care for allegory, and Lewis does. And then like Jared C. Wilson wrote a great article saying that Chronicles of Narnia are not allegory, and there's. Depending on what you mean by allegory, Lewis only wrote one allegorical piece, and that was The Pilgrim's Regress. But these are fuzzy concepts today in our modern parlance. And what I appreciated from your maybe it was in your introduction, but you said that there's Tolkien did say that he didn't like allegory, but then yet he did use allegory. Can you help us with that?
Ooh, yeah, very fuzzy. So again, I think part of the confusion, I'll just cut right to the chase, and then I'll go into what he actually says, which are all in his letters for the most part.
Okay.
I think part of the confusion arises from not distinguishing allegory as composition or genre on the one hand, and on the other hand as a mode, that is a way of using language in a poetic work, but the whole work may not be dominated by that mode, but it includes it.
Yeah.
Okay, so allegory as mode versus allegory as genre / composition. I think that Tolkien's hatred or dislike, he cordially dislikes it in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings. Allegory in all of its manifestations, he says. But then elsewhere, he's going to contradict this. So what is he talking about? Well, is he talking about allegory as composition or in genre, or allegory as mode? Based on if you take that text in isolation from the foreword to The Lord of the Rings, then you're going to think, whatever, he just hates allegory. but that's, and you could, and I've seen books and scholars who have just wrapped it up and said, well, there you have it, folks. It's not that simple. Elsewhere, in the letters of correspondence composed by and arranged by Humphrey Carpenter, who also wrote a biography of J.R.R. Tolkien, he says several other things. He says, any interpretation of any poetic work is going to inevitably use allegorical language. Okay. And then elsewhere he says the Lord of the Rings is not a allegory of atomic power, but of power as domination. So he says it's an allegory. It's just it's not about what you think it is. You've drawn the wrong correspondence. So he calls the Lord of the Rings an allegory. He just says it's not an allegory of what you think it is, what so many readers and writers writing into him thought it was. And then even elsewhere, he makes the case, and you have to kind of put this together, that fairy story, and you can read this in his letters and on fairy stories if you do the research, and I showed in the book that what he says of his kind of allegory and what he says of fairy story is very close together. And so I'm going to put all this together later for you, but definitely some all over the place language from Tolkien. But I think it arises from that failure to make a distinction between composition and genre and mode.
Yeah,
there's more.
That's
to
a
say.
very helpful. That's such a helpful classification there. So you could say like, yeah, I just don't like the genre of allegories because they're kind of childish and they're so on the nose and there's obvious, and yet still use an allegory in your science fiction. You know, so it's a different genre, but you're still using it as a tool, as a mode of expressing something. You're just not ballooning it up to the full category and saying this, I'm writing this piece in the genre of allegory. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And then even from there, he says one other thing, and that's right. I think it is a helpful distinction, but we can even go deeper and eventually simpler. We'll put all this together. But I just remembered that elsewhere in his letters, he says, and I remind readers of this in my book several times, just so you don't lose track of it, that he specifically disliked only one kind of allegory, which was he dubbed it the conscious and intentional kind, as you said, kind of on the nose. Yeah. So there he's definitely targeting allegory as not mode, but as genre and composition. He says, I hate books or dislike books that altogether, when you consider a whole work, we take one book, it just screams clear on the nose allegory. That I don't like. But he elsewhere commits to saying the Lord of the Rings is a type of allegory, just not that kind. And he says that allegorical language is inevitable in writing a story. The more life, he says, a story has, the more easily it's going to be to read, and trace an allegorical correspondence. So you can't not write an allegory to some extent. But you can prevent it from being the obnoxious kind, and that is what I would submit he does. And maybe I was hard on Lewis because he's not the subject of my book, but I think, to his credit, he's often very elusive, just like Tolkien is, but elsewhere he's very clear. And so there is a difference between the writers, and I think that's where Tolkien had the problem. I think that Tolkien disliked some parts of the Chronicles because it broke into a very clear allegorical mode, and that started to add up to making the whole work seem like a simple retelling of a story we already know.
Yeah, definitely. And guys like, I think it's Michael Ward, Ward. I think it's Michael Ward would say that, he said, Tolkien just didn't get what was happening. That Lewis was, he was telling a story about the seven heavens, and so maybe some of the breakdown was there, but.
I agree. And Michael Ward's Planet Narnia book is what I think you're thinking of. Yeah, it's an excellent book. Nobody saw that. I mean, he uncovered such a medieval vision behind those books. And I certainly think there's much more to it than most people, maybe including myself, for a time gave credit for. So, yeah, I think we should be a little less hard on Lewis. But, then again, I think Lewis made a comment, it's in the book, where he might have been, according to one author, talking about Tolkien. And Lewis said something like, one whose work in which the Christianity is latent may do more of a better job than one in whose Christianity is more explicit. And he was making a contrast, or a comparison rather, to himself and Tolkien. So maybe Lewis was self-conscious. I don't know. There are real good Lewis scholars out there like Michael Ward and Alistair McGrath who would know better than I would. But anyway, that's another subject maybe for another talk. It's great stuff.
Yeah, no, I that latent piece I wanted to bring up. So I'm just gonna go off of our outline here. Hopefully not too far, but so this is interesting because to me it always seemed like, growing up, my dad read the Lord of the Rings to me before the movies came out, so we could watch the movies together, and absolutely loved it. And then we would pick up on certain motifs, and you'd see Gandalf. Spoilers, I guess. He would die and come back as Gandalf the White, and you see like there's some kind of Christ motifs there. But it always seemed to me like, there's this some kind of latent Christianity. There's like latent Christian motifs in there, and that I made that connection with Lewis. That that's what Lewis was doing in his more science fiction-y stuff, though he was more on the nose than Tolkien. But what you're arguing in your book is, and maybe this is wrong, but that Tolkien was a bit of a Christian apologist. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I wouldn't be probably the first. I mean, I have to think of who else. I want to be respectful of other scholars who might have pointed this out. I can't recall. I don't want to certainly take credit for having said it first, but maybe recently a scholar, myself, to point it out more clearly that yes, he was an apologist, and I think we define an apologist as one who defends the faith in an intellectual and an imaginative way that engages both the heart and the mind. And I think Tolkien certainly does that. And yet he was not the prodigious theological writer that Lewis was, layman though he was, as far as, no seminary training. But, Lewis's background speaks for itself. I mean, he was qualified to write on this. Mm-hmm. But, I think maybe Tolkien, somewhere I remember reading this, might have begrudged him this and felt, whoa, you're the well-to-do apologist, and here's me, laboring away at this perfectionist mythology. I certainly think he wasn't, announcing this, but I think he was a very humble. In my notes, I answering your outline here, I said to myself, I think, he was a very reserved and guarded and humble apologist, but he nevertheless was, and I think part of the uniqueness of my book, that I'm building on one of Tolkien's very good friends who Tolkien confided in. He was a Jesuit priest who already picked up on this, that Tolkien knew the art of the parable. Father Robert Murray, who delivered a sermon in 1992 celebrating the 100 years of Tolkien's birth, and gave a sermon entitled that. And it's an essay that I included in my book. And he makes the case that is how we should understand Tolkien as an apologist. He was he knew the art of the parable, and I talk about what that is throughout my book. And I think that qualifies him as an apologist, because Jesus, as we know, was an apologist extraordinaire and used parables. A third of the Gospels are think parables, especially the Gospel of Luke. So I think he was definitely.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love that. And it does kind of shift my perspective a little bit on the latent aspect, that maybe it wasn't just because he's a Christian, he writes with Christian motifs, but maybe it was a little bit more intentional. And I wanted to finish up on our definitional stuff, and then we can really jump in. So sure. Maybe we can touch on mythos, myth, Tolkien's conception, and fairy stories.
Certainly.
So what's the ancient conception of myth versus the modern, and then how should we think about myth?
Yeah, let me address that, but then also give you that little visual chart and kind of describe how we can wrap all this up.
Yeah,
if you don't mind, I'll do that first, and then I'll kind of tie it up with what you asked about myth.
Yeah.
So if you imagine a spectrum, and I submit this argument in my book, that you can either make the case that Tolkien operated from a classification of parables, or a classification or genre of allegories, and you have to really pick one. And anything you can say that parables do, allegories do too. And so I take the evidence and I say, okay, let's pick one. Let's say there are many different kinds of allegory rather than parable. Let's say that's the category, and we have a spectrum of allegories. So now we have a clear definition. This is what I'm going with. On one end of the spectrum, you have the allegory of composition, right? That is, in every facet of that story, it is knit together to have not only the mode of allegory, the way the language is used is very direct and very clear, and very seldom is the story ever concealing anything, right? Yeah. And this is very clearly in composition and in mode a thoroughgoing allegorical story. And that we would call this, on the one end of the spectrum, the conscious and intentional allegory. That's what Tolkien called it. And that's the one he disliked.
Yep.
You call it a crude allegory too. That's what Joseph Pearce has called it. And I agree. It's in your face. On the other end of the spectrum, in this model I'm using, that is a typology or a classification of allegories. Another kind of allegory is the parable, the New Testament parable. And there we find, a story that we've already talked about what parable is, that does have the allegorical mode. Certainly there are familiar aspects and types in the story of the parables of Jesus that lure you into participation, and you recognize these elements. But then there's a twist, and we're going to talk about this, I'm sure, but The twist is the shift from allegorical language or mode to metaphorical language or mode. And the difference is that metaphor is suggestive of what it's hinting at. It's not exact like allegory. It's more indirect. And so the parables are differentiated from the other end of the allegorical spectrum from their back and forth, their hide and seek, the conceal to reveal, the shift between the allegorical direct language and the metaphorical indirect language. And you might just say this as the shift and alternation between the familiar and the strange in Jesus' parables and in Tolkien's. Now, on this other end of the spectrum we've been talking about, the parable, it can also be pointed out based on research of Tolkien's fairy story and this essay that I said Tolkien's good Jesuit friend wrote, Tolkien and the Art of the Parable. Well, in that essay, he makes the connection between fairy stories and parables. And he says that we can find a lot of synergy. That is, what we can say of one, we can say of the other. And Tolkien was kind of conscious of the unbaptized roots of fairy, he said. And so maybe he was trying to say fairy stories were really kind of a nascent version of the New Testament parable. And so he makes this connection. And he says, what you've said about parable and the parables of Jesus, you can also say of fairy story. And so it's clear that Tolkien may have been influenced by the New Testament parables. And so I would say parable / fairy stories on one end, crude allegory on the other end. And just to review, the differentiation is that the parable / fairy story alternates between direct and indirect language, or allegorical, direct, metaphorical, indirect language, and is revealing through concealing, playing hide and seek. And then the allegory is just here it is. I'm laying out all my cards. Almost throughout the whole story. Tolkien says that these stories meet in the middle, the fairy story and the crude allegory, they both meet in the truth somewhere. They're both trying to explain a reality or to explain something, but they do it in very different ways. Now that we've established how they do that, and we can talk more about it later if you want, but I would just say one last thing in summary, that the parable / fairy story, because it's more metaphorical and less allegorical, is designed to expand your theological horizons. It's designed to teach you new information. Whereas the allegory, the conscious one, on the other end, is there to remind you of what you already know, and not to really teach you anything, but to just say, hey, you know your stuff, right? You know your doctrine, your creeds. And so there it is. Now, how is this related to myth? I don't know if you want to jump in at all. I certainly.
No, that was so good. I'm ready for more. I want to hear some more about some myth and mythos and
Okay, great. So thank you. So the Greek term word mythos, usually doubled together with logos. Both of these words originally in the pre-modern ancient sense, according to scholars who have written about this today, like Alistair McGrath, who probably has written about it most popularly. Even popular authors who we may not, in an orthodox way, see eye to eye with, but like Karen Armstrong, who writes popular religious literature, writes extensively about mythos and logos, has pointed out that these concepts before Plato, before the 5th century BCE and the 4th century BCE, when Plato was alive, during the time of Alexander, before that, and before the advent of Thucydides and Herodotus and the historians of ancient Greece, they really kind of overlapped and intermingled, and mythos and logos meant the same thing. And what that thing is that they meant true utterance, or a true story, a statement, a proposition about fact. Truth, Lewis said, is always about something. Reality is that which truth is about, right? So, your philosophy, right? So that's what, a mythos is, a true utterance. It's a statement about the way things are. And so I say in my book, a la McGrath and many others who've written about this, even Tim Keller, that a myth is a story about reality. And McGrath, especially in his recent book, Narrative Apologetics, has connected mythos to the term meta-narrative, which we all know is a grand story about reality. So they're the same thing. And ancient conception of mythos was basically that poetic statements about truth or about reality and imaginative statements, were considered real. And it wasn't just the historical, the rational, the scientific, the empirical. But when Plato started to kind of separate them, and Herodotus and Thucydides through their works, and Plato had his opinions about religion and state and things and history, and using allegory as a stepping stone to get to the truth. But that began to change. And then in the Enlightenment, but even long before that, you have the Epicurean philosophers who kind of anticipated the Enlightenment. In the modern conception of myth, of course, it was the exact opposite, is a false story. The modern notion of mythos is that it's a false narrative. It doesn't tell us anything about the way the world is. And so you think of people like David Hume, anything who can't be proven empirically or mathematically should be confined to the fire, and human reason is God. And so if we can't deduce it empirically, scientifically, rationally, it ain't true. And if it ain't true, then, it has no bearing on reality. And so that modern conception began to shift. And you know this, philosophers like Hume confused metaphysics and epistemology, and assumed that you could have an epistemology without a metaphysics first, right? And you could start neutrally with, here's how we know truth, and then build up from there. And you can't do that, honestly. And myth changed because of that in the modern world. And so myths became little short stories that, might have a kernel of morality to them, but ultimately false.
Yeah.
That's the modern conception of myth, sadly.
Yeah. That's I'm hearing myself a little bit on your end.
Oh, am I echoing, or you're echoing?
I'm good now. Yeah, there we go.
Better? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that modern conception, it's funny that the ancients didn't think, they thought, here's a story of reality. And I love that word meta narrative. A couple of my professors don't like that. They think we should just stick to worldview, but meta meaning, beyond, or, think of metaphysics, what's beyond physics or what undergirds physics. And the meta narrative is this grand overarching story by which you can make sense of the world. And if that's the conception, then we all have this meta narrative. If you're a naturalistic determinist, you think that the whole world is just matter in motion. You have a grand scheme of how we got here, and then you try to build up, what should we do? And you have a mythos. You have this conception of the world. And it's funny that I understand it a little bit, right? Because some of these myths, you look back and you can read, if you're Jordan Peterson, you can read into all sorts of, true statements into them. Some of them seems like, it's just, that's ridiculous, right? And some are what people call just so stories. This, you can look at the Genesis, and this is a just so story, kids. This is how the serpent lost his legs. And you can make that, a childish little story, and it seems conceivable. Yeah, that's just a myth, right? But I love this grander conception of mythos, of myth, of worldview, of meta narrative, and something that was interesting to me to find in your work was this narrated worldview. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Certainly. Yeah, I picked this up. Really, I've been soaking in Alistair McGrath for the last several years, and he was just really instrumental for helping me find the philosophical verbiage to structure the arguments of my book. And I know that he's taking his cues from several other scholars, and we'd have to chase down some bibliographies here. I always like to say where I'm getting things from. I know we have a lot of scholarly listeners, so he's written a lot about it, but a lot of popular authors today are writing about this concept of, myth/meta narrative as narrated worldview. That is, a myth should be understood as a person's fundamental orientation and view of reality, which is what a worldview is. The answer to, those 5 basic questions, but told through an indirect, mythical, that is narrative way. That is, it's your view on where we come from, who we are, what is truth, what is meaning, what is right and wrong, and the values of good and bad, and where we're going when we die, and where is history going. Those overarching, sweeping questions are told in a narrative form, right? And so that's your worldview, but that's all propositional stuff, and that argumentative, straightforward, discursive, propositional, logical way of arguing things is really good. I mean, you think of William Lane Craig; he's the master of that. But it's sometimes it's exhausting. And I know Paul Gould has written about this too. That we need those appeals to the imagination. It's just sapping to have too much of that. And so this concept of myth as narrated worldview kind of addresses that. Can't we say this in a more creative, colorful way? And yeah, we can. We do it all the time, right?
Yeah.
If I were to just talk to a buddy, or I talk to my students all the time, and I say, well, just tell me where you think we come from. Like, well, where I was born. I'm like, no. Like, just tell me a story. Tell me, have you ever wondered about why we're here rather than not? And people will start telling stories, and yet in those stories there are unfolded truths.
Yeah.
And we do it all the time. So
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to look at mythos that brings in that ancient conception that we talked about, and does not confuse truth with factuality or epistemology and metaphysics, right? That there are many ways to speak truth about the way things are, and it's not just limited to those naturalistic assumptions that so many people assume today are the only ways to know truth. And so I think it honors the metaphysical side and the physical side, right? And myths do that. They honor both sides.
Yeah.
Supernatural and the natural. Yeah.
I love that distinction you were making between worldview and meta narrative. I see that play out in systematic theology and like biblical theology, for instance. So systematic theology is you're looking at the system of theology, and you can pull out different doctrines. You can look at the doctrine of the incarnation, and you can look at the doctrine of sin or original sin. You can look at these different doctrines systematically, and you can look at the biblical phenomena that back them up. Or you can look at biblical theology, which traces themes historically through the Bible as God has progressively revealed himself. And you can see the biblical meta-narrative, which is creation, I would say creation, fall, redemption, consummation. And that's our grand story.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so within there, you say, well, okay, well, what do you mean by redemption? Okay, well, now we need some systematic theology. We need to pull out, redemption. We need to pull out, what is the theology of the cross, and we need to go into that kind of stuff. But so you need both, just as you would need a worldview, you need propositional truths which are encoded in this meta narrative. I love that. I think it's a helpful conception for listeners.
Yeah, I do too, and I've been greatly helped and nourished by it in my own walk with Christ. And like I said, I mean, the work of McGrath today, I mean, he's just written some exceptional work. So everyone should really look into his book. So his most recent book, or maybe it's not the most recent, but I think it was one of the most recent books. He writes so many, but
he writes
narrative. Yeah, he does. Narrative Apologetics is really a great book, and it's all about what I've done here. And so it's also cultural apologetics, right? It's using narrative and the power of myth to appeal to the imagination and the heart and the mind through it. And it's great what you just said. And so, yeah, I think we do need both, though. You can't have too much mythos and no logos, because obviously they overlap. And the word mythology in Greek itself is a compound word that shows you the truth of that.
Right.
Mythology is a person's narrated worldview. It combines overlapping epistemologies and ways of knowing truth about the world we live in propositional, straightforward, rational ways, and then in those more indirect means. And yeah, you can't pit them against each other. Or you shouldn't, I should say.
Yeah.
But people often do. Yeah.
Yeah. I really like that. I think that that can bring us right into another interesting point that I found in your book. There was a lot, but another one was the narratival criteria for judging between worldviews and religions.
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain, like, you lay out some criteria, or you explain a little bit how narratival criteria can help us in picking and choosing which worldview is true.
Yeah, exactly. I do a little bit. I wish that I had spent a little bit more time, like with a list, as Doug Gruthius has done. Apologies if I've mispronounced his name. I feel that I have, but
I don't know if anyone knows how to pronounce that dude's name.
Well, he and I are in the same boat then, because I get people that always make mine a little bit more exotic. It's like Jahosky, and I'm like, yeah, he threw his in there. That's good. I like it.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's got like a list, and I always find lists are very helpful, and so we talk about criteria. And I like the way you worded this in your outline. And so I kind of said, I should probably revisit some of those things I wish I had said in the book. But what I do say in the book is that a religion and the myth that goes with the religion, i.e. the worldview, should be judged by its ability to make sense of all the data of reality. And this is something that across the board, all apologists in every niche are talking about.
Yeah.
One thing I would say I talk about that's a big thing, is that a worldview has to answer questions of origin and identity. And I took this cue from Jeff Myers, who, Ravi, when he was alive, Zacharias also had, I think, 4 questions. And each apologist has their own way of wording it, but it basically is the same. It's where we come from, who we are, definition of what a human is for teleologically. Mm-hmm. What is the purpose of life? What is truth? Is it subjective, objective? It's a bit more complicated than that. What is right and wrong? Where are we going? And so I think, firstly, so those are my 5 questions that I usually use: origin, identity, meaning, morality, destiny. I'm not the first to do it. A worldview's got to explain those. It's got to explain them well. It's got to ring true with existential, subjective intuitions. It's also got to ring true of logic, laws of logic, which are not, you can't pick up laws of logic and leave them if you don't like them. They're laws, right? Like the law of gravity. So you've got to obey them whether you like them or not. So I think obviously it's got to address those, and it's got to fit in logically with the world as we know it. I think another thing I just pointed out here, I'm just looking through, a worldview's got to cohere. The story's got to make sense within itself. And then that coherent story has also got to correspond to using kind of Aristotle's correspondence theory that most apologists kind of assume. It's got to correspond with the way things are in lived out ways. It's got to make sense of history. It can't be too much mythological. Now, one of the things that Lewis and Tolkien wrote about Christianity is that it is like every other religion. It has that mythic quality. But the one big difference is that, unlike Osiris and Balder and Adonis and the other dying and rising gods, is that this is a historical story. We have archaeological evidence and historical textual evidence, and it's got to have some factual adequacy. Doug Groothius says. He says existential viability, which we've talked about. It's got to answer those questions, and I think these are some good things to start thinking about what are the narratival criteria for judging between worldviews. The big one for me, though, and I was saving this one for the end, is, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I hope it makes sense, is that just take Christianity. The Christian myth, that is the Christian meta narrative, has to be able to make sense of other worldviews.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah. And I'm glad that I've been really praying and thinking on it lately, because it's really been affecting me. And I'm thinking, wow, let me turn that around. Like, we have to have an objective criteria here. So we can't just say Christianity has to do this. Buddhism has to be able to do it. Can Islam and Buddhism or secular humanism, take any non-Christian worldview, can these worldviews explain the existence of Christianity and themselves? And the answer is, I don't think so. Not when you stand them up to extreme scrutiny. Islam especially has a really unique relationship between those two. But if your worldview, your theory of life, your hypothesis about the way things are, your narrative that you live in can't explain the existence of other worldviews, then I think it fails as a test. So I think that's the big one. Yeah,
I love that. I see so much overlap between. There we go. Yeah, I see so much overlap between the narratival approach and some philosophy as well. So in philosophy, in epistemology, there's like particularism and there's methodism. And in particularism, you look at all the facts. You got all these facts together, and you try to come up with a theory that makes sense of these facts. We do that in science as well. Good science will try to come up with a theory to explain as much of the phenomena as it can. And then you have the Methodists who they go method first. And they want to say, well, I have this method, and then we can see if we do actually know all these data points. And so I think what's interesting about this narratival approach to other religions is exactly what you're saying. If your theory is a methodistic approach that starts with the method first and can't fit in all the data points, then there's something missing, especially if a competing view can fit in everything. And Lewis talked about that as well with other religions, how if you have Christianity, you can make sense of other religions. If you don't have Christianity, you can't make sense of any of them.
So glad you brought that up. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so it's exciting for me, because instead of saying, well, now there's all these other different religions and, that should mess with you. You think that yours is right. You say, well, actually on mine, we can make sense of why there's other religions. We can make sense of why there's the corn king who rises and dies. We can make sense of this rising and dying and rising motif, because
Yeah.
on Christianity, that's the greatest story ever told. That's the meta narrative that rings true to all of us. And so every religion is going to have some kind of rising and dying motif, all the way down to a Jackie Chan movie. Jackie Chan has to get beat up first before every good hero. That's why Superman was no good until Kryptonite came along.
My God.
You have to have this. It's God's meta narrative. And of course, every worldview is going to have to make sense of that, because it's in us. We see it in the fall. The trees die and they come back to life. And it's the greatest story.
That was rousing. And I'm with you, man, 100%. I couldn't agree more. That's why I really took to that kind of part of the research. And I think you just explained it brilliantly. And I love the connection to the film too, because it makes sense. All of our obsession with these stories, and the exiled and returning king is another motif that I think, the Arthurian legends always touched me as a kid in my heart, and something I couldn't quite put my finger on. So that's good stuff. And I think that's it. And what I was going to say, what you remind me about particularism, I think this matches up with what McGrath says, because he's a scientist as well, where he says it's the inference to best explanation. And I correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds more like an abductive approach to, and I think that's what Sherlock Holmes does. Everybody thinks he was more deductive, but I think it was abductive is what he was more famous for.
It's deductive, Watson, and it's like, well, it's abductive, dear Watson. Yeah,
we should change that. Somebody should really tap somebody on the shoulder about that. But I think that's what I'm getting at, is it's more of an abductive approach. And like I said, I think there are a lot of great scholars today who are pioneering this narratival criteria for worldviews and their religions. And so it's a very big field right now. It seems like a lot of people are working in that. I just mentioned a book by Benson Fraser, who his whole book is about that. It's about indirect communication, and he gets into that. And I think he uses the work of Kierkegaard to explain that, who wrote about it as well. So anyway, great topic. Hope that answered what you were looking for a little bit.
Well, and I think it leads right into a little bit more of your stuff on Middle Earth. So, we talked about whether Tolkien was a Christian apologist, and he was. He was more indirect. He was more modest. But let's talk about, how does the realism of Middle Earth, how does it have anything to do with Christianity?
Yeah, so I compile several lines of argument throughout the book, and you have to kind of piece it together. I don't have them all in one place, but in the introduction, I talk about the existence of types, which are things or events or themes that God puts into place that point to the antitype, the thing that they signify, which it just so happens in our tradition is the great archetype that draws all things to himself, and that's Jesus. I think that's one way that the imagery of the Lord of the Rings leverages these images that are also found in the Bible and in other myths, like Arthurian myths I mentioned. And the exiled and returning king is a very powerful one. It's a universal one, and it's a very effective heart myth. It really, something about it, Peter Kreeft wrote pretty movingly and dramatically about it in one of his books, where he said, something in us longs to give a king our allegiance, and it really moves us and affects us. And I'm like, wow, I think that's what I've always wanted somebody to say, that I either didn't have the courage to say myself or didn't know that that's what I wanted to say. But that's how this story moved me. And I think so the types, the imagery, the symbols in the story are very biblical. And as we know, God as king in the Bible is one of the big ones. So that's one way. I think the realism of Middle Earth has anything to do with it being Christian is via the types found in the story. And their degree of correspondence to the archetype, right? And so the Bible has certain types that the Lord of the Rings also employs, and I think that all points to Jesus. And so that connects us to the realism part. Well, the Bible and the authors of the Bible, under the guidance and inspiration of the Holy Spirit, believe that this story, the story of Israel, is a microcosmic story of all of our stories, the story of humanity. And that's another way of saying it's the story of reality itself and the way things are. And so any story, i.e. Lord of the Rings, that borrows types or images and metaphorical allusions to this same story, and I'll give you some other examples here in a second, is going to be realistic because of what the Bible claims. The Bible's already claiming through the Holy Spirit, through the direction of God, that this is the story of the way things are. And any story that has those same kinds of feel. So one other example would be the same plot, and you mentioned it earlier: creation, fall, redemption, consummation, or restoration, as some scholars say. By the story having that very clearly, and redemption as being the return of this exiled king in particular, it really creates a lot of reminders to the biblical story, and thus to the story of the way things really are. And
Yeah.
so I think that's how, through multiple steps, Middle Earth feels real, because it has that incarnate Christian worldview or myth inside it, and it points us to the world outside us, and we feel like we're really part of that story that God has put us in, and that's because we are.
Yeah.
And I think that's what it is. There's more, but that's good for now.
Well, I love that because I work with a lot of young dudes, and a lot of young dudes love listening to Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, and I like it too, man. I'm a young dude, youngish,
Yeah,
and
yeah, me
so
too.
Peterson talks about that in like how Harry Potter. You know, why is Harry Potter so important? Well, because she's gotten the archetypes right. And so Peterson has this whole theory because he's a Jungian, so he's following these archetypes, and Jung, you know, I would say he stole from the Christian worldview in following these archetypes. But so we would say, I think what you've said is that Tolkien is getting the archetypes right, but not because of the collective unconscious, because we all have this in our collective psyche, but rather
Right.
because he's following from the inspired archetypes. So we have archetypes out here in the world that we can acknowledge and experience, and we can see why this movie did well and this one did poorly because it messed up the archetypes. But then we have this book that's been inspired by God with his inspired archetype, saying this is the theme of reality. And then maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems as if maybe Tolkien's universe is a type that's pointing to the antitype of the Bible.
Yeah,
that
I think, yeah, I mean, what it's so a type, the way we trace it to the correspondence that it has to the archetype is how strong that type is going to be on the Christian worldview of things. And so I think that what we see is, and how I word it in the book, is that Tolkien's parabolic novel or parable is about what the gospel or Jesus's parables are about, meaning they're both pointing to the story of the way things are.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's, I think, what we're trying to say. I think we're both saying it in different ways, but yeah, is that the types in the Lord of the Rings point not only to types outside the Bible, but inside the Bible, and are richer for that. And it contributes to that, just that great degree of realism that it has.
Yeah.
And as you look at those types, you can see that they draw and share in the body of the real archetype to a great degree. So long as we're using Jesus and the Bible as our model and our measuring stick, we're going to see that. But yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Well, that's awesome. Another thing that struck me, which was completely brand new to me in reading your book, was you say that the Hobbit and the Silmarillion act kind of like the Old Testament.
Yeah, do you like that?
It was like, dude, I'd never ever considered that, but it's so interesting, and it gave me a different view of the Old Testament, because I'm viewing it as those, you know, it helped me understand, insofar as that's true, it helped me understand a little bit more about the Old Testament as preparing the way for, you know, the New Testament. And then, you know, Lord of the Rings would be like a New Testament parable.
Precisely, which is itself a miniature proclamation of the gospel itself, right? And so, yeah, this was pointed out, and it wasn't really developed very much in his book, because it was about the Inklings in general. But I got the idea from researching, and I said, you know, somebody ought to really build on this, and I started to, and that became the book. But it was an English author. I'm trying to remember his name. Christopher Scarf has a book about the Inklings and their works, and the theme of kingship in them. And he says, and I've just a parallel to this, I've realized that Richard Hayes, and the way that he tells us in his books to interpret the New Testament and the Old Testament, how they relate to each other, I noticed the synergy when I sat back and I looked at this and I said, wow, the way we read our Bible is most important, of course, but it's clear that Tolkien was influenced by this. And I think this is the way he wants us to read the Lord of the Rings. And then I went to Scarf's book, and he said something like this. He said, the act of looking back at the Númenórean kings and the dwarvish kingdoms and all the backstory stuff, i.e. the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, is parallel to the act of looking back from the New Testament to the Old Testament. And I thought, that does make sense. And then I looked in Tolkien's letters, and what do you know? He says, quote, part of the attraction, I think, of The Lord of the Rings is the glimpses in the backstory, right? That you can see these glimpses to a vast history stretching into the background of The Lord of the Rings. And it makes you want to go there and kind of find out, well, what is, who is Melkor, or who is the first Dark Lord, and where does Sauron come from? And who is Beren and Luthien that Aragorn is singing about? And you're like, I don't know who these people are. Nobody's introduced them to me. And he's right. That attraction, it draws us and makes us want to read those other books. Yeah. And then when we look back to them, we start to make connections between Beren and Luthien, which was an elf maiden, Luthien and a man, and Arwen and Aragorn. And you're like, oh, okay, now I see that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think, of course, the thing I shy readers away from is saying that the Silmarillion and the Hobbit are exactly telling the exact same story as the Old Testament, because they're not.
Right.
But they contain the same themes and the same types and imagery that you find in the Old Testament, especially that king that you hope is going to be this great king. And in the writings of Ezekiel and Isaiah and the prophets, you get this expectation that, the son of David's going to come back, and you get that in the story of the dwarves a little bit. You get the story of the fall. You get the story of creation in Tolkien's Old Testament books, and you get it obviously in the Old Testament. So anyway, you start making these connections. They're never one-to-one, so they're not incredibly allegorical,
right?
But they are really unmistakable. And I think Tolkien said it best. He said, all of this was really Christian in the revision, not consciously. When I was writing it, I didn't do this consciously, but in the revision of my works, he said, it all kind of came together.
Yeah.
And it's a very Christian work. So
I love that. And I love, you mentioned Hayes. We read him in seminary and stuff, but it's striking. It's interesting thinking about reading The Hobbit and the Silmarillion in light of the Lord of the Rings, just like reading the Old Testament in light of New Testament. And you start to see all that time I put into reading Chronicles. Oh, it's starting to make some more sense. If I would have paid attention a little bit more, right, maybe I would have seen it. But I have this key, I have this New Testament key for interpretation. And when I read Jesus's lineage, I go, holy cow, Rahab, that she wasn't just some minor character in this thing. She's in the Lord's lineage. Holy cow. And you start to see the significance of all these events taking place. And you get to see the great grand narrative that God is this storytelling God. He's not just like this efficient computing machine. He's not just this efficient chess player. He is a grand storyteller who had all this in mind and who's directing and weaving history and telling a story with history, which is fantastic. His story, right? Yeah.
Yeah, his story. Yeah. And that's it. It's so true. And I think this parallel act of looking back, remember Tolkien said what he just said about the revision, that it was a Christian story in the revision after he looked back on it. So I think that itself is a clue. That's why in my book, I invite readers to start with Lord of the Rings and then to look back on the prequel books. And I think that's parallel to what the risen Jesus tells the disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. And he says, then he took them through Moses and the prophets to show them, where he was in those scriptures. And he invites us to have that retrospective hermeneutic that is so crucial in the writing of Hayes, for example. So anyway, I think it's a good way to read Tolkien's tome, right? And it makes it that intertextuality between his books and the intertextuality between the New and Old Testament makes a resemblance to the Bible and thus to the bigger story we're a part of.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing that really says, wow, this sounds familiar,
Yeah. And that just continues that sense of realism that we feel like, along with, he's a fantastic writer. And someone said something like, every step you take in Middle Earth has history. You're stepping on like someone's bones or something like that. And, this was where Melkor fought this battle or something. Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's definitely a minefield of all sorts of references. And he is a wonderful writer. And a lot of people can't stand the extended landscape descriptions and the trekking over the dells and the hills and stuff. But I love it. It just immerses you and makes you think you're in a familiar place. And then the shock comes and you're like, wow, this isn't home.
Yeah.
So it's great. He is a great writer. Yeah.
Well, Michael, man, this has been awesome. We've gone into all
Yeah.
sorts of literary genres and tools and all sorts of great stuff. Thanks so much for all your time, man.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. I had fun.
Yeah. So for all the listeners right now, go grab this book. We talked about a lot, but there's a lot more in the book. There's a lot more specifics. There's a lot more on how the gospel relates to the Return of the King that we could have gone into that we just don't have time for. Go buy the book. It's a good book. I recommend it. Tell your friends about it. Michael, I'd love to have you on again sometime to talk Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, all sorts of good stuff like that.
Anytime, man. Thank you so much again.
Awesome. Well, this has been Parker's Pensies. We could talk about it more. Hopefully, Lord willing, we will someday. But for now, it's going to have to do it. As always, all glory to God.